obviously, you're best known for not necessarily for a great thing, which is being fired as acting Attorney General.
There was 27 years prior to that.
That was going to be my first point.
Yeah.
But you have a long, long career as Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, and now you're partner in special matters and government investigations at King and Spalding. And throughout that entire career, the thing you focused on most, which I think is quite pertinent to what happens next year, is public corruption. And looking at that, what do you think corruption in public life is worse now than it has been?
Well, look, I think part of it depends on how we define corruption. The idea of public officials being on the take is nothing new. That's been around from the beginning of time. I think what has changed and what has gotten worse is that it's gotten more sophisticated now. Sort of the old days of cash in a paper bag. It doesn't happen very often that way, and instead what you have are more sophisticated schemes involving conflicts of interest and otherwise. And from my perspective of, when I was a line assistant United States attorney all the way through, I prosecuted corruption cases, and to me, we need to look at it more broadly, not just whether you're taking cash payoffs, but whether as a public servant you truly are acting only in the public's best interest, not your own personal interest, not partisan interest, not the interest of your friends, but whether you're fulfilling your oath to be the guardian of the public's interest.
But do you think the law helps you in that, or do you think that does the law cover that particular issue?
Not especially, no. But I don't think that really ought to be the standard. I mean, I would hope that we are expecting more of our public servants than just anything short of a felony is okay in terms of conduct.
To start.
I think, we don't want felonies either, but the standard should be higher than that. But it shouldn't necessarily be higher in terms of when we would deprive someone of their liberty and send them to prison. That's a different thing.
But what is the mechanism beyond public disapproval, evil journalists like me, and pollsters even, whatever it is, what is the mechanism for enforcing that sort of difference between felonies and things that we all think are bad?
Yeah, well, I guess I would disagree. It's not evil journalists. I actually think the free press plays an absolutely essential role here in holding public servants to account. And I don't mean just elected officials, but really all public servants. And look, it's really up to us as the people to decide what standards of conduct that we're going to insist upon for our public officials.
But do you think the standards have generally drifted and are likely to go down further?
Yeah, it's harder to shock us these days, it seems.
Yes.
And so I do think, to a certain extent, look, I think everyone would agree now if you were to pay someone cash for an official act that that's a crime, and we don't accept that. But conduct short of that has become more blurred. It's become more acceptable and sort of been in the barrage of news. As I said, it's gotten harder to shock us now.
On the conflict, but on that particular thing of conflicts of interest, do you think that there should be some standards which are at least semi-legal, everything, or semi-legally enforceable? Things like you have to deliver your tax return, you have to do things like that. Would that make a difference?
Well, there are some criminal statutes that deal with specific financial conflicts of interest on the federal side. They're very narrow statutes, but sure, I mean, I think that transparency is what really breeds trust. And if someone raises his or her hand and says that they want to be entrusted by the people of our country, not just in the presidency, but in other positions as well, but they want to be entrusted to make decisions for us, with that comes a responsibility of transparency as well, so that the public can have confidence that those decisions are being made purely based on what's in the public's best interest and not the individual's.
But is there one change you would want to make to either the legal system that really could begin to push transparency as an issue?
Well, the tax returns would be a good place to start.
Yes. What about, I mean, again, this is an inevitable question for someone raised abroad, but one very obvious thing about America, which is worse than anywhere else, is the degree of money politics.
Right.
Is that a basic reason why this is so difficult?
Look, I don't know that you can trace it back to any one particular reason. Certainly, over time, And after Citizens United, for example, there's lots of money in politics without the transparency, without knowing who is actually providing those funds to a candidate to be able to run for office. So certainly I think that has a chilling effect on some people entering into the political realm. I mean, we shouldn't want just people who are either independently wealthy or folks who have an ability to be able to tap into those kind of super PACs to be running for office. We should have a broad spectrum of people, from my perspective. We should have a broad spectrum of people who are serving in public office.
With more public funding of elections?
You know, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on how I can spot the issue. I'm not sure I've got the answer to it.
Can I ask you about a particular thing I know you've looked at, voter fraud? I mean, that would seem to be another area where there is corruption in public life. Is that getting worse, and what is the answer to it? I mean, obviously you've got the Georgia connection.
Yeah. Well, actually, the thing I'm more concerned about than voter fraud is voter suppression. Yeah. I mean, actual voter fraud, impersonation, is exceedingly rare. You wouldn't know that from sort of the rhetoric that you hear, but I think from the studies that I don't believe have been disputed since the year 2000, I think there have been like 34 cases of impersonation, voter impersonation. And yet we've had lots of statutes that have been passed in legislatures that have made it more and more difficult for people to be able to vote. And look, I'm from Georgia. I'm in the South. We have a painful history there of, in the not so distant past, Jim Crow laws, where there was a systematic effort to prevent African Americans from voting. And so when you see other laws that are being passed that seem to make it unnecessarily difficult for people to be able to exercise their right to vote, that's a troubling trend, I think.
But is there, again, another answer to that, which is to take it, again, take the law into politicians' hands, at least in this way, or take it out of their hands, and stop this being a thing that politicians themselves oversee and have a much more beefed up, I suppose, independent Public Elections Commission or something along those lines?
Yeah, well, that's something that there aren't really federal rules with that. That's something that is specifically state by state. And I wouldn't like the chances of being able to federalize that. It's a state by state thing. And we have seen there have been some instances in some states actually of efforts the other way, of automatic voter registration and expanding early voting and other things that actually make it easier for people to be able to vote. And it just seems to me, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, we should all have an interest in trying to encourage as many Americans as possible to vote.
Maybe go a little bit towards the great subject of our time, conflicts of interest and the Trump presidency. Has he got more conflicts of interest than any previous president? Or what is the particular problem there? Is it just a multiple series of small conflicts of interest, or is it just a bigger thing?
Look, I'm not going to pretend that I know the actual answer to that question. I think that's part of the problem, is I think he certainly has the appearance of more conflicts of interest because of the failure to completely divest from some of his financial interest. And look, I don't know, if you were to dig into it, what impact, if any, that has had on any of the decisions that he's made. But I think that misses sort of the larger point. The whole purpose in these laws is so that the public will have confidence again that those decisions are being made only in the public's best interest. And because of the shroud of secrecy over his taxes or financial interest, we don't really know. So I certainly wouldn't presume to say that, yes, there are financial conflicts. That wouldn't be responsible of me to do, because I don't know the answer to that.
But
I think that's part of the problem. It's
the appearance which is the difficulty.
Yeah.
And do you think that going forward there should actually, again, be a legal change that forces presidents to divest or do something similar to that?
Yeah, that's one of sort of the peculiarities of our law, is that these rules generally apply to everyone except the president. But in the past, we have had individuals serving in the presidency who have recognized the great privilege of that position and have not looked just to what they are required to do, but rather what they should do to carry out their oath and to have the public's confidence. I suppose to the extent
there's a kind of theme in some of the questions I pushed towards you, that in all these areas you have had so far in America a presumption that politicians would somehow do the right thing. And then if politicians generally, maybe Mr. Trump specifically, are not doing the right thing, then you would imagine that the law is the way to solve that.
Yeah, I do think you have to be careful, though, sometimes, and not necessarily with respect to the financial disclosures, but I do think that we have to presume a certain level of good faith in the individuals who assume public office. When you start trying to legislate to every conceivable way someone could abuse their position, you start then creating a real morass of technical rules that, frankly, we're not going to come up with every way that someone could abuse their position. People do things that would never even occur to you that someone would think of doing. So, gosh, I hope we don't become so cynical that we believe that we have got to nail down everything with the law to prevent someone from abusing their position.
Can you perhaps give us some view? You've been obviously very close to a lot of these things as Attorney General. You've got the Mueller investigation happening. We're looking at the year ahead. Why would you expect that to go? What is your perspective on it?
You know, I don't know any more than anybody in this room about where that's going to go. And the one thing I do know, though, is, you know, I know Bob Mueller, and there is no one who is better suited to this job than Bob Mueller. He is the quintessential, I'm going to date myself when I say this, sort of Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am kind of guy. You know, I was telling you, he doesn't even wear colored shirts. He only wears white dress shirts. I mean, he is a straight arrow who is going to call it like he sees it without an agenda to try to get anyone. But likewise, we should also take comfort that he's not going to try to gin up some case that doesn't exist either to satisfy anyone's interest. So the tweets and all of that kind of stuff, if it rolls off anybody's back, it rolls off Bob Mueller's back.
Do you worry, just on that, is that under this presidency particularly, a lot of the institutions that people have looked to, the Justice Department, police, spies, Pentagon even a bit, this particular president has been more cavalier about criticising his own civil service, so to speak. Does that also cause you problems?
Yeah, actually, I think that's the most dangerous thing that's happening right now. Look, I certainly have policy disagreements with this administration, but elections have consequences. You have to expect that there are going to be policy decisions with which you disagree. But what is different is a systematic effort to undermine the public's confidence in democratic institutions, from the Justice Department, our intel communities, to the courts, the legitimacy of courts, to a free press. You know, these are things you can debate specific decisions about these institutions. You can debate whether you agree with a particular decision by a judge, but trying to undermine the very legitimacy of that judge or of our judicial system, just by way of example, is something that is not only new, but I think really dangerous, because we can't expect that at the end of this presidency that we are elastic enough to where the public confidence all bounces back to these institutions. And for a lot of the reasons we were just talking about a few minutes ago, these institutions really only function properly if the public has confidence in them. You know, the Department of Justice really can only function if the citizens of this country respect and believe that decisions are being made based on the facts and the law and nothing else.
Do you think it's at a worse stage, the Department of Justice's reputation from that angle, or the questions being asked about it? You know, is it really worse now than it was, say, during Watergate or those sort of eras in public life?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the Justice Department took sort of the same hit in Watergate, and you know, and there you had the Justice Department at the end. They're resisting the efforts of the president to use the Department of Justice. You know, I'm not suggesting by this that decisions are in fact being made at DOJ based on political reasons, but it sure isn't for lack of trying from the president's part. And again, it doesn't really matter whether those decisions are being impacted or not if the public believes that those decisions are being impacted or could be, then the confidence is lost. And I know from even talking with clients now, the companies will express concern of whether they could become in the target if the White House doesn't like a particular merger or has some reason not to like a particular organization. So, this is, again, it doesn't hinge just on whether DOJ is actually being influenced.
And if you were the new Democratic House, what should you do? I mean, in all this area of conflicts of interest, some people, there's the impeachment question, but there's also a whole series of different inquiries. Which sort of ones make sense to you? What if you were congresswoman? Yeah. What would you do?
Well, look, I think certainly there's an important role for Congress to play in the checks and balances, and I think it's really important that there be that check. There hasn't been over the last 2 years. On the other hand, I think it's also important that the Democrats not use that oversight authority, or I wouldn't say use, but abuse that to essentially harass the administration on small, inconsequential things. And so I think it's going to be really important that they exercise that oversight on things that matter, whether it's interference in the Russia investigation or otherwise, but not have it devolve even further than it has.
But does that sound like you would rather have one big kind of conflicts of interest investigation which covers everything rather than have endless small probes? Well,
certainly you would hope there would be a coordinated effort that would go on in the House where they would sit down. I mean, look, I don't know. I've never been in Congress. I don't really know how it works, but I would hope they would sit down and have some discussions about what committee, who was going to do what, rather than there being sort of a race to who can have the flashiest hearing.
Yes. Do you worry that the whole image of American politics is being compromised by all this? That you look around the world, people used to come to America as a standard bearer of democracy, which was not just to do with whether elections were fair. It was also to do with all these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly, to me, that the most dangerous thing is not just what's happening during this term, but what effect it has on us beyond this. On the other hand, at the risk of being just a terrible downer here, I will say, I think that our institutions are really strong. And while they're taking hits right now, and particularly from the public confidence standpoint, I believe that there's resiliency there, and that the people who are in these institutions, the career folks at DOJ and in the intel community, scientists, others that that are just there every day with their heads down trying to do their jobs, that they're going to be there at the end of this time as well. And so I am optimistic we'll bounce back, but I think it's going to be painful getting there.
Would you recommend to someone young now that going into the civil service, going into public service makes sense?
Yeah, it's funny you say that, because I've done over the last year or so a good bit of speaking at colleges and law schools, universities, and inevitably one of the questions I will get is some student will raise his or her hand and say, I had planned on going into public service, but I just can't do it now because I don't want to be part of the Trump administration. And it may shock you all to know that I then spend the rest of my time trying to convince that person to go. In large part because I think if we lose that pipeline of bright, dedicated, energetic young people who want to go into public service, we're going to feel the effects of this administration for decades to come.
It goes both ways, though, doesn't it? I could be a bright young Republican who would now fear going to work for the Trump administration, not because of anything I might do, but because of all these Democrat investigations. I would need to go in there with 20 good lawyers to defend me in the future.
I'm assuming if you're coming right out of college or law school, you're not going to be going into a high-ranking enough position to where anybody in Congress is going to be terribly interested. Yeah. And my advice to someone going into the administration would probably be different, not for that reason, but would be different if you're talking about sort of a more entry-level position or cabinet-level position.
I suppose I should end by, your name is often mentioned in the context of political ambitions. Do you have any ambitions? Now is the perfect time to announce it.
No, look, I believe in public service. I wouldn't have stayed at DOJ for 27 years if I didn't. But I think that there's a difference between public service and running for elected office. And I just have to confess, running for office is just not anything I've ever felt drawn to.
Is that just one last thing? Is that because of everything we mentioned earlier, the money politics, all those sort of things?
You know, you'd think I've been asked this question enough times I would know the answer to that. I'm not sure why it is. It's just you kind of know what feels like you or doesn't. And look, my husband wants me to do it, so he always tells me when I answer this, he says, leave just a little bit of room so if you change your mind. But I seriously doubt that.
He sounds a very foolhardy man.